The box wrapped in rough white paper sat dead center on my wedding reception table. No bow, just the words, "For M," scrawled in black ink. As I reached out, Julian, my husband of exactly 3 hours, clamped his hand around my wrist hard enough to leave a red mark. "Don't touch it," he growled through his teeth. His eyes cut straight past me, locking onto the open bar. Standing there was Chloe, my flesh and blood. The little sister I used to skip meals for just to pay her college tuition. She raised her champagne flute in my direction. The corner of her mouth twitched into a smirk as she mouthed 3 soundless words. "Catch it now." She wasn't here to celebrate my wedding. She had just used my name, my military ID, and the most important day of my life as a drop point for a federal money laundering package, right in front of my entire chain of command. She banked on the fact that a logistics officer like me would bite my tongue and bury it just to save face. But I didn't. Before I tell you exactly how I flipped the board on her, take a second to hit like and subscribe, but only if you're actually hooked on this story. Also drop your location and local time in the comments. I'd love to know where you're listening from. The humid August air hung heavy under the outdoor pavilion at Fort Haven Field. A string quartet dragged their bows across cellos, bleeding out a painfully slow rendition of Etta James's "At Last." Waiters in crisp white shirts circulated through the crowd, pouring cheap champagne into expensive glass. It was supposed to be the perfect facade, a normal wedding for a normal bride. Then I saw it, a square box, wrapped in matte white paper. It sat on the auxiliary gift table near the head seating. It had no ribbon, no tape holding down the edges, just 3 letters written in thick black marker for M, a sickeningly fake stab at intimacy. I spent my 20s living out of duffel bags and eating MREs in the dirt just so I could build a life with 0 loose ends. And she brings this right to my front door. 10 minutes ago, before I walked over to salute Colonel Harrington, that table was empty. Now this thing was just sitting there absorbing the afternoon sun. Guests brushed right past it, laughing, drinking, completely blind to how wrong it looked. A foreign object dumped into a highly controlled environment. My hand moved on instinct. Muscle memory. You see an unidentified package in your perimeter, you assess it. But before my calloused fingertips could even brush the coarse grain of the paper, Julian was there. He didn't yell. He didn't make a scene. His hand just snapped around my wrist, locking it in midair. The grip was pure steel. I looked up at him. Julian's jaw was a granite block. His eyes didn't even drop to the box. They were fixed across the manicured lawn, piercing straight through the crowd of uniforms and evening gowns to the open bar. I followed his line of sight. Chloe. She was standing there in a designer silk slip dress that cost more than my first used Chevy, twirling a half-empty champagne flute by its stem. Her perfect salon-fresh manicure gleaming under the string lights. When she saw us looking, she tilted her head. A predatory, slow-motion tilt. The smile stretched across her face didn't even come close to reaching her eyes. It was a dare. A taunt from a parasite wearing my family's DNA. My chest tightened. The biological shock hit first. A cold rush of adrenaline flooding my veins, pooling heavy in my gut. I couldn't breathe. Not because I was heartbroken, because I was trapped. She had brought this here. To a military installation packed with high-ranking naval officers. She weaponized my own wedding, knowing I'd be strapped into a white dress, paralyzed by the social expectation to just shut up, smile, and play the happy bride. She wanted me boxed in. My fingers twitched. Every nerve in my body was screaming at me to reach into my dress, pull my phone, and call base security. Julian felt the shift in my pulse. He didn't speak. He just gave a microscopic tilt of his chin to the left. At the edge of the tent, Hayes and Vance, 2 Navy officers from my logistics unit, stood up from their folding chairs in unison. No hesitation. Just the silent execution of an unspoken order. Across the grass, Chloe saw the movement. Her smirk dissolved. She didn't panic. Narcissists never do when they have an exit strategy. She simply turned on her heel. No dramatic goodbye, no loud arguments. She slipped toward the back of the tent, blending into a group of tipsy relatives, and vanished behind the heavy white canvas curtains. like she was just heading out to check her makeup. Not a single smudge on her reputation, leaving me to clean up the blood. Clean, surgical, ruthless. The string quartet hit a high note. The sound grated against my eardrums like metal scraping on concrete. Hayes stepped up to the table. His dress uniform was immaculate, but his posture was coiled spring. He pulled a handheld metal detector wand from his inside jacket pocket, ran it over the white paper. Silence. No beep. But the muscle jumping in his jaw told me everything. He scooped the box up under his arm, his broad shoulders shielding it from the crowd, and walked straight toward the administrative office behind the main hall. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind him. The pavilion felt like it was closing in on me. The smell of roasted prime rib from the catering station suddenly made my stomach churn. The realization was a physical weight pressing down on my lungs, crushing the breath out of me. My sister hadn't just crashed my wedding to ruin a party. She used my security clearance, my spotless record, my entire goddamn life as a human shield for whatever the hell was inside that box. Julian stepped closer, closing the gap between us. I felt the warm, heavy pressure of his palm slide against the small of my back. It wasn't a romantic gesture, it was a grounding tactic, an anchor in a storm. "She knows exactly when to strike," he murmured. His voice was low, vibrating with suppressed violence. I stared at the spot where the white box had been sitting just seconds ago. The rough grain of the wooden table was bare, but the contamination was already spreading. I set my jaw, locking down the panic. I let the cold, hard discipline of the uniform take over. I forced my spine straight. The sister who paid for everything was dead. The logistics officer was clocking in. "I think this is her plan B." The reception died a quiet, sudden death. Military crowds know when a front is collapsing. You don't need to announce a retreat. A silent, heavy tension swept through the pavilion. Guys in dress uniforms set their glasses down. They gave stiff nods, grabbed their wives by the elbow, and walked to their cars. No one asked questions. No one offered fake sympathy. They just cleared the blast radius. The drive back to our house was dead silent. The tires hissed against the wet asphalt. Rain started smacking the windshield, washing away the last remaining illusion of a celebration. We pulled into the driveway. The house stood there in the dark, cold, and empty. I walked through the front door and went straight into the bedroom. I reached behind my neck, grabbed the zipper of the custom gown, and yanked it down. The heavy, expensive silk slid off my shoulders. It hit the hardwood floor with a soft, pathetic rustle. I stepped out of it and left it lying there. A discarded skin, a costume for a play that got canceled. I pulled on a pair of stiff black utility pants and a faded gray crew neck. I grabbed a rubber band off the dresser, pulled my hair back tight enough to strain my scalp. I looked in the mirror. The flushed, smiling bride was gone. The cold, calculated logistics officer was looking back at me. I walked down the hall to the kitchen. The room was pitch black except for the pale blue light throwing shadows against the cabinets. Julian sat at the heavy oak table. His large frame was completely still. The laptop sat open in front of him. He had not touched the trackpad. The internal cooling fan whirred, cutting through the dead silence of the house. I stopped on the opposite side of the granite island. The cold stones seeped through my socks. Julian looked up. His face was a slab of granite. "She has been testing your perimeter for years, Molly." I did not answer. I kept my eyes on the blinking cursor on the screen. "She knew you would not stop her at the reception," he said. His voice carried zero pity. It was just raw tactical analysis. "She knows you confuse guilt with family loyalty. Every time you tell them no, you feel like a traitor. She weaponized your own decency. She did not need your permission to pull this off today. She just needed you to hesitate. And she knew you would." The words hit like a hammer against my ribs, because he was right. I spent my entire adult life trying to outrun the trailer park. I broke my back in supply depots, lived on cheap instant coffee and canned beans, slept on military cots that smelled like bleach and industrial cleaner. I clawed my way up the ranks to build a bulletproof credit score, a spotless federal record, all so I could have a life with zero loose ends, and my own flesh and blood used my silence to bleed me out. I moved past Julian. I walked straight into the spare room we used as an office. I crouched in front of the heavy steel filing cabinet. The metal was ice cold against my knuckles. I punched the combination into the lock. The deadbolt snapped back with a loud, heavy clack. I pulled the bottom drawer open. Buried underneath old deployment orders and property tax records was a black external hard drive. It was encased in solid rubber. Waterproof, shockproof. A vault of digital dust I thought I would never need to look at again. I carried it back into the kitchen. The rubber gripped my palm. I sat down in the wooden chair next to Julian. I plugged the cord into the side of the laptop. The device hummed to life. The screen flashed white, then populated the desktop with dozens of folders, spreadsheets, tax documents, the entire architecture of my financial existence. I clicked on the main backup folder, opened the message archive, scrolled back to last winter. The breadcrumbs were all right there, tiny poisonous little traps disguised as sisterly affection. The screen glared against my face. I read the text logs out loud in my head. Just checking in on you. Hope the base is treating you right. Might send a small gift to your unit for the holidays. Trust me, I just want to catch up. We are blood. I dragged the mouse down. The pattern shifted. The fake warmth disappeared, replaced by specific targeted requests. Hey, can I use your old address for a job application? They need an out-of-state reference. Do you still have a copy of that old Georgia lease I need to prove residency for a background check? My jaw locked tight enough to grind my teeth into powder. This was not a sudden crime of opportunity. Chloe did not wake up yesterday, look at a calendar, and decide to crash my wedding to launder dirty cash. She had been building this blueprint for months. Brick by brick, message by message. She spent a solid year systematically eating my identity. She carved out my history and wore it like a mask. My hand gripped the edge of the table. The wood grain dug hard into my palm. My pulse hammered a slow, heavy beat against my eardrums. I moved the cursor across the screen and stopped. The little white arrow hovered right over a folder labeled W2, Taxes 2021. The exact folder I sent her 4 months ago when she called me crying in the middle of the night, begging for help with a financial dispute. I rested my finger on the mouse button, ready to pull the trigger. My index finger pressed down on the mouse. A sharp, dry click echoed off the kitchen tiles. The folder opened. The label read W2, Taxes 2021. A PDF document loaded on the screen, bathing the dark room in a harsh white glow. The federal seal. My full legal name. My rank. And right there in the top right corner, 9 digits. My social security number. The golden ticket. The key to every background check, every security clearance renewal, every loan I ever took out to pull myself out of the dirt. I guarded that number with my life. Bile rose in the back of my throat. I tasted old coffee and pure concentrated shame. I did this. I handed her the gun. I loaded the magazine. I put it right in her hand. The memory played back in my head, loud and clear. It was a Tuesday night in November. Chloe had called me. She sounded frantic. She played the concerned little sister routine perfectly. She said she was taking a finance class at the community college. Said she wanted to compare our tax deductions so she could help me build a better portfolio for my retirement. We are family, Molly. Let me look out for you for once. You work too hard. Those were her exact words. I was tired. I had just pulled a 14-hour shift logging heavy machinery parts at the armory. My brain was fried. My back ached from lifting steel crates. And for one stupid weak second, I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe my sister actually gave a damn about my future. So I sent the file. I gave her the foundation. She took those 9 digits and built a shadow version of me in the dark. She used my blood, sweat, and hazard pay to forge a key to the federal banking system. I stared at the 9 numbers on the screen. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together, locking into place with a sickening thud. 4 months ago. My phone buzzed on the nightstand at 2 a.m. It was Chloe. She was crying, heavy gasping sobs that sounded completely real. She told me she was in a legal dispute with a sleazy landlord in Brooklyn, claimed he was trying to ruin her credit. She said she needed a secure address to receive some dispute documents. Just one package, just one favor. Please, Molly, you have a military address. They will not mess with you. Just sign for it. I told her no. I told her I would not put my security clearance on the line for her drama. I did not care if she was getting evicted. I hung up the phone and went back to sleep. I thought that was the end of it. But a parasite does not just stop feeding when you push it away. It finds another vein. She needed a federal drop point to clean her dirty money. When I refused to let her use my mailbox, she pivoted. She looked at the calendar. She saw my wedding date. She knew the base commander would be there. She knew I would be standing in a white dress, surrounded by brass, trapped by the social pressure of a perfect day. She bet her freedom on my restraint. She wagered that I would rather swallow a crime than cause a scene in front of my commanding officers. If Julian had not grabbed my wrist at that table, if I had reached out and untorn that rough white paper while the photographer was snapping pictures, I would have been holding a federal crime in my hands on camera. I would have been an accessory to a felony. I reached out and grabbed the top of the laptop screen. I slammed it shut. The plastic casing cracked together like a gunshot in the quiet kitchen. Julian did not flinch. He just watched me from across the granite island, waiting. There were no tears. My eyes were bone dry. The crushing weight in my chest, the heavy suffocating guilt of betraying my own blood was gone. The heat drained out of my blood. The silence inside me did not feel like resignation anymore. It froze over. It hardened into a solid block of ice, sharp as a razor. For 31 years, I let my mother and my sister treat me like a human dumpster for their mistakes. I paid the bills. I fixed the wrecked cars. I took the blame. Chloe thought I would stay quiet because I always stayed quiet. She calculated that my loyalty to the family name would protect her. She had no idea what the silence of a cornered animal actually felt like. My loyalty was dead. I pushed back from the table. The wooden chair legs scraped hard against the floorboards. I walked out of the kitchen and went to the front closet. The sky outside the window was pitch black. The sun was still hours away from breaking over the horizon. The rain had stopped, leaving a cold, damp chill hanging in the air. I pulled a thick manila envelope from the top shelf. I walked back, yanked the rubber hard drive out of the laptop port, and shoved it deep into the paper envelope. I grabbed the printed W-2, shoved that in too. I sat down on the bench by the door and grabbed my combat boots. I shoved my feet into the heavy leather. I pulled the black laces tight, wrapping them around the eyelets with brutal force. I tied them off with a double knot. Every pull was a promise. I stood up. The rubber soles struck the floor with a heavy, dull thud. The wedding was over. The honeymoon never even started. I tucked the manila folder tight under my arm, right against my ribs. I grabbed my car keys off the metal hook. The jagged metal dug into my palm. I looked at Julian. He was already standing, his jacket in his hand. NCIS field office, I said. I turned to the brass deadbolt and pushed the front door open into the dark. The drive to the federal building took 40 minutes. The sun was just starting to threaten the horizon, bleeding a bruised purple through the heavy rain clouds. I didn't turn the radio on. Julian drove the truck in dead silence. The tires ground against the wet highway. Every time the wipers slapped back and forth, it felt like a metronome ticking down the seconds on my career. We pulled into the gated lot of the NCIS field office just before 5 in the morning. The air inside smelled like stale coffee, floor wax, and ozone. Agent Sterling was waiting at the security checkpoint. She didn't offer a handshake or a sympathetic smile. She just swiped her keycard and held the heavy steel door open. "Back here," she said. We followed her down a hallway, lit by buzzing fluorescent tubes. She ushered us into an interrogation room, completely stripped of personality. No windows, gray acoustic panels on the walls. One scratched aluminum table bolted to the concrete floor. 2 steel chairs. The AC was cranked so high the sweat on my neck instantly turned to ice. Julian stepped inside and pulled the heavy door shut until the latch clicked. He didn't take a seat. He backed into the far corner, crossed his thick arms over his chest, and locked his jaw. A physical barricade standing between me and the hallway. Sterling dropped a thick manila folder onto the center of the aluminum table. The rough paper scraped across the metal. It sounded like sandpaper dragging over a coffin lid. "Tech unit pulled the encrypted USB from the white box," Sterling said. Her voice was flat, purely administrative. Ran it through an isolated terminal 15 minutes ago. She flipped the heavy yellow cover open. She pushed 3 sheets of printer paper toward me. Invoices, 6-figure wire transfers, routing numbers for offshore accounts. And right at the bottom, sitting perfectly on the dotted line, was my name. I leaned in, bracing my forearms against the table. The signature was flawless. It had the exact aggressive slant of my M, the sharp, hurried loop of the E. If you handed this to a bank teller, they would process it in a heartbeat. But I spent 12 years signing supply manifests on the hoods of running Humvees and the freezing decks of naval carriers. I knew my own handwriting. "It is a digital stitch," I said. My voice was a low rasp. I tapped my index finger hard against the paper. "Look at the ink density. There's absolutely no variance in the force of the stroke. It is perfectly flat. Someone scanned my signature from a PDF, cleaned up the background, and stamped it on." Sterling didn't blink. "Correct." She flipped to the next page. It was a business registration form filed in the state of Delaware. The date stamp read 2 weeks ago. Butler and Coins Holdings. My stomach turned over, a slow roll of pure, toxic disgust. It wasn't just my forged signature. They used my social security number. They used my military ID number. They even used my old apartment address in Georgia from when I was stationed at Fort Benning. "That is a shell corporation," Sterling said. She tapped a cheap plastic pen against the metal table. Clack, clack. "Set up exclusively to filter dirty cash from an illegal sports betting ring operating out of the East Coast. The white box dropped at your wedding today." That was a delivery confirmation. A ledger. The final physical link in a federal money laundering chain. I stared at the paperwork. My military ID. The piece of plastic I carried in my left breast pocket every single day. The badge I bled for. The absolute proof that I dragged myself out of a dead-end trailer park, bypassed the addiction of my hometown, and made something of my life. My own flesh and blood stripped it off me and wore it to run a cheap street hustle. "Where did the digital registration originate?" I asked. "We tracked the IP address from the initial LLC filing," Sterling replied. She pulled a printed screenshot of a terminal log from the back of the folder. "It pings back to a residential router. A 3rd-floor walk-up in Brooklyn. Chloe's apartment. The exact same apartment I co-signed the lease on 3 years ago because her credit score was completely trashed. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. The betrayal was so massive, so absolute, that it just burned out the emotional receptors in my brain. There was nothing left inside my chest but cold, hard clarity. My sister didn't just crash a wedding. She strapped a federal felony to my back and pulled the pin. She needed a clean name. Sterling continued, her eyes locked on mine. Someone with high-level federal clearance. Someone nobody would ever audit. She forged your consent. They didn't need her consent. The voice came from the corner of the room, deep, gravelly. I looked over my shoulder. Julian was staring at the gray wall. His eyes narrowed into dark, violent slits. "They didn't need her permission," Julian repeated, shifting his gaze to Sterling. "They just needed her habit of delaying. They knew she wouldn't open a strange package in front of her commanding officer. They banked on her keeping her mouth shut to protect the family name. It was a tactical drop." Sterling looked back at me. She didn't offer sympathy. "Federal agents deal in facts, IP addresses, and prison sentences. Pity doesn't close cases." "Lieutenant Butler," Sterling said. She leaned forward. The metal chair groaned under her weight. "This is felony identity theft, wire fraud, money laundering. If we do not have a sworn statement on record right now, you are legally tied to this shell company. You go down with them." She slid a blank statement form and the black ballpoint pen across the freezing aluminum. I looked at the pen. For my entire life, I was the shield. I took the hits. I absorbed the damage so my mother wouldn't cry and my sister wouldn't fail. I was the good soldier who always cleaned up the mess. That soldier died the second Chloe smiled at me with that champagne glass. I placed both of my hands flat on the freezing metal table. I let the cold seep deep into my skin, grounding me, erasing the last pathetic trace of family loyalty I had left. I looked Sterling dead in the eye. "I am ready." Agent Sterling stood next to me in the observation hallway. The overhead lights hummed, casting a dim yellow glow over the linoleum. We stood shoulder to shoulder, staring through the two-way mirror into interrogation room B. The feds kept the room set to 60 degrees. A cheap psychological trick to make suspects shiver. To make them uncomfortable enough to start talking to stay warm. Through the thick glass, I watched my sister. Chloe sat on the opposite side of the aluminum table. Her legs were crossed tightly at the knee. She wore a cream-colored silk blouse tucked into tailored black trousers. Her hair was blown out, falling perfectly over her shoulders. She looked like she was waiting for a mimosa at a Sunday brunch in Manhattan, not staring down federal wire fraud charges. But if you knew how to look, the facade was already cracking. The heavy layer of expensive foundation could not hide the bruised purple bags under her eyes. Her manicured thumbnail picked nervously at the skin of her index finger. A rat trapped in a steel box. She waived her right to counsel, Sterling said. Her voice was flat-bored. Thinks she can talk her way out of it. They always do. She thinks she can talk me out of it, I replied. I reached for the heavy metal handle. Lieutenant, Sterling warned, do not let her steer the narrative. I pushed the door open. The hinges whined a high metallic shriek. The cold air hit my face instantly. It smelled of industrial floor wax and ozone. I stepped inside. I wasn't wearing my dress blues. I didn't need the brass collar devices or the service ribbons to prove who I was. I wore a plain white button-down shirt and black slacks. Standard issue civilian clothes. Molly, Chloe said my name lightly. An airy, breathless whisper, like we had just bumped into each other in the produce aisle at the grocery store. I didn't answer. I pulled the steel chair out. The metal legs scraped hard against the concrete floor. I sat down, planted my boots flat on the ground. I kept my spine perfectly straight, resting my hands loosely on my thighs. And I just stared at her. I let the silence hang in the freezing air. I let it wrap around her throat. 10 seconds. 20. Narcissists cannot survive in a vacuum. They need a reaction to feed on. Without your anger, your tears, or your forgiveness, they suffocate. She broke at 35 seconds. Her shoulders slumped a fraction of an inch. You were always so hard, Chloe whispered. The fake airy warmth drained out, instantly replaced by the victim routine. I thought you would understand. Out of everyone in this family, I thought you would get it. I kept my face completely blank. Understand what? That I was in a bad spot. The rent the car. Understand that you used my military ID to funnel dirty cash through a shell company. My voice sounded like a machine. Dead. Methodical. Understand that you deliberately waited for my wedding day to make a drop right in front of my commanding officers. Chloe flinched. She looked away, staring at the blank gray wall. A tear slipped out. Cheap non-waterproof mascara left a dark smeared track down her powdered cheek. The smell of her expensive floral perfume suddenly hit me. It was sickeningly sweet. It smelled like rot covered in sugar. I didn't think they would trace it back to you, she choked out. I leaned forward. I placed my forearms on the freezing metal table. I closed the distance between us. Listen to yourself, I said, grinding the words out through my teeth. You are only sorry that they traced it. You never once thought that what you did was actually wrong. She swallowed hard. The skin around her neck flushed an ugly mottled red. The classic Darvo playbook was booting up. Deny, attack, reverse, victim, and offender. It was just supposed to be one run, she pleaded. Her voice pitched up, getting frantic. Derek set the whole thing up. He said it was easy money. He told me the feds do not look at active duty accounts because you guys get a pass. I am drowning in debt, Molly. The credit card companies are calling my boss. Derek swore this was safe. He pushed me into it. You know how guys like him manipulate people. Stop! The word cracked like a rifle shot in the small room. Chloe snapped her mouth shut. Her jaw trembled. Do not drag some low-level street hustler into this to cover your own tracks, I said. My eyes locked dead onto hers. Derek did not steal my social security number. Derek did not call me crying 4 months ago to get my tax forms. You did. You were the one at the warehouse. You signed the federal paperwork. You pulled the trigger. Her chest heaved. The breathing was erratic, shallow. The elegant, untouchable act was completely gone. She looked at my face, desperately searching for a trace of the older sister who used to take the blame for her broken curfews. The sister who used to hand over her paycheck from the diner so Chloe could buy a prom dress. She found nothing, just a steel wall. She leaned over the table. Her manicured hands shook as she reached out, hovering just an inch from my arm. She didn't dare touch me. She looked up with wide, wet eyes. "Can you fix this?" The question hung in the freezing air of interrogation room B. It did not sound like a plea. It sounded like an order masked as a question. The exact same tone she used when she wrecked her first car at 17 and called me at the diner to deal with the cops. The same tone she used when she blew her rent money in Vegas and needed me to wire her half my hazard pay just so she would not get evicted. I looked at her hands. They were hovering over the cold aluminum table. Her manicured nails tapped a frantic, erratic rhythm against the metal. I let out a slow, heavy breath. The air pushed out of my lungs, carrying 31 years of accumulated garbage. 31 years of being the designated shield for a family that never gave a damn about the bruises I took. "Fix this," I repeated. My voice was a flat line. No anger, just dead static. "Let me get this straight. You mean you want me to walk out into that hallway, sit down with a federal agent, and swear on a government record that you had my permission?" Chloe shut her mouth. Her teeth clicked together. She looked down at her lap. She did not say yes. She did not say no. The dead silence was the most shameless confession I'd ever heard. I slowly shook my head. I looked at the woman sitting across from me. The cream silk blouse, the blown-out hair, the smeared makeup. I did not see a sister. I saw a complete stranger, a parasite that had finally run out of blood to suck. "I cannot do that," I said. "Molly, come on," she begged, leaning over the table. The smell of her sweet, suffocating perfume pushed against my face, mixing with the harsh smell of floor wax. "Just say you let me use the address for a mail drop. Just tell them it was a misunderstanding with the LLC paperwork. You have a spotless record. You are a lieutenant. They will listen to you. They will just drop it." "No, they will not drop it. They will charge me with perjury, strip my rank, and throw me in Leavenworth." "They won't." "Because the exact second I clean up this trash for you," I said, cutting her off, my voice dropping an octave, "I officially become the exact thing you have always used me as. A blind, dumb workhorse who ignores right and wrong just to protect the family name." Chloe blinked hard. The crocodile tears finally spilled over, cutting fresh tracks through her expensive foundation. She gripped the edge of the aluminum table. Her knuckles went white. "You do not understand how bad this is," she hissed. Her voice cracked, leaking pure panic. Derek flipped. He threw me under the bus. He went to the feds first and blamed the whole operation on me. The guy is a rat. I'm going to take the fall for a setup. I did not flinch. I did not lean back. I just watched her scramble. It was pathetic. She wanted to play with the big dogs. She wanted the fast cash and the designer clothes, and the second the feds kicked the door in, she turned into a whining child, pointing fingers at the guy standing next to her. "You partnered with a street-level grifter to wash illegal sports betting money, and you are surprised he cut a deal to save his own skin." I asked, my voice dripping with contempt. "You played a stupid game." "He lied to me." "Yos, then maybe it is time you stop playing the victim in a scam you directed," I said. I gave her one sharp, decisive nod. "You signed the W-2 request. You set up the LLC. You made the drop at my wedding. You made the choices. Now own them." If you have ever been the person expected to clean up your family's toxic messes, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment below and tell me about the exact moment you finally walked away. Tell me what broke the camel's back. I read every single one because I know exactly how heavy that broken loyalty feels. Behind me, a sharp double tap echoed through the room. Knock, knock. The agent standing behind the two-way glass. Time was up. I placed my hands on the table and pushed myself up. My boots hit the concrete floor. The sound was heavy, final. I did not feel a single ounce of regret. I did not feel the crushing guilt that usually came with telling my family no. I just felt light, like a 100-pound rucksack had just been unbuckled from my spine. I turned toward the heavy steel door. "Molly, please." I stopped. My hand hovered over the cold metal handle. Chloe was staring up at me. Her face was completely hollowed out. The arrogant, untouched girl from the wedding reception was dead. She was just a cornered suspect in a cold room wearing clothes she bought with stolen money, staring down the barrel of a federal indictment. "Please," she whispered. Her voice broke into a pathetic, jagged sob. "Please, do not hate me." I stood perfectly still in the doorway. I did not turn my body to face her. I just looked over my shoulder. I looked at the wreckage of my own flesh and blood. She wanted anger. She wanted me to scream at her, to call her a bitch, to give her some kind of emotional reaction so she could feel like we were still connected, like we were still family fighting it out. I didn't give it to her. "I do not hate you, Chloe," I said. The words tasted like cold ash, completely empty. "I just will never trust you again. And that is so much worse." I stepped out into the hallway and pulled the heavy steel door. It slammed shut with a deafening crack. People think federal court is loud. They watch too much television. They expect screaming lawyers, dramatic confessions, and gavels banging on wood. It is not like that. Federal court is a machine. It is quiet. It is beige. The carpets are thick and industrial, designed to swallow the sound of your footsteps, so you feel completely insignificant. The air smells like lemon floor wax and old paper. It is a meat grinder wrapped in bureaucracy, and it does not care about your tears. I sat in the second row of the gallery. My spine was pressed perfectly straight against the hard oak bench. Julian sat on my right. He did not fidget. He was a solid wall of muscle and silence. At the defense table sat Chloe. She did not wear silk today. She wore a cheap, stiff navy pantsuit. Her hair was pulled back into a tight, severe bun. She was trying to look respectable. She was trying to look like a victim who just got caught up with the wrong crowd. It did not work. The federal judge sitting behind the elevated mahogany bench looked at her like she was a stain on the floor. She took the plea deal. She had to. The paper trail was absolute. The judge read the terms in a dry, bored voice. Wire fraud. Identity theft. She avoided a cell block, but the hammer still dropped. 3 years of supervised federal probation. Mandatory restitution of the stolen funds. But the real kill shot was the conviction itself. A federal felony. I watched her shoulders cave in. A felony is a permanent brand. It does not wash off. She just lost her right to vote. She lost her right to own a firearm. Every background check she ever runs for the rest of her life will flag her as a fraud. She tried to steal my spotless military record and bought herself a life sentence in the gutter. The bailiff walked over. He slid a piece of paper across the heavy wooden table. Chloe picked up the black pen. Her hand was shaking so badly the pen rattled against the table. She signed her name. It was the physical act of handing over her freedom. She slumped back in her heavy leather chair, completely hollowed out. She did not turn around to look at me. Not once. Then the heavy side door opened. 2 U.S. Marshals walked in. They were massive guys built like brick walls wearing tactical vests. Walking between them was Derek. The silence in the courtroom was broken by the harsh metallic sound of steel on steel. Clack, clack, clack. He was chained at the waist and the wrists. Derek still had his chin tilted up. He walked with a heavy swagger, acting like a street hustler who was too smart for the system. He refused the plea deal. He pleaded not guilty. He actually thought he could beat a federal prosecutor. The prosecutor did not even raise his voice. He stood at the podium and laid the cards flat on the table. He entered the IP logs from the LLC registration. He entered the security camera footage from the warehouse in Brooklyn. Derek did not flinch. He whispered something to his public defender and smirked. Then the prosecutor pulled out a thumb drive, a wiretap from a burner phone. He hit play. The audio crackled through the courtroom speakers. Static hissed, and then Derek's voice echoed off the beige walls. It was dripping with cheap, arrogant bravado. "Molly is busy saving the world," the recorded voice sneered. "She will never notice it." The smirk vanished from Derek's face. The swagger drained out of his body in real time. He stared at the speaker like it was a loaded gun. The judge looked down over his reading glasses. He did not waste time with a lecture. He dropped the sentence. 18 months in federal prison, immediate remand, no bail pending appeal. The 2 marshals grabbed Derek by the triceps. they hauled him out through the side door. The steel chains rattled violently against the door frame and then faded down the concrete hallway. It was over. 10 minutes later, I stood out in the wide corridor. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. An administrative clerk walked out of a set of double doors and handed me a clipboard. There were no trumpets, no formal apologies from the government for the hell I went through. Just a standard release form confirming my security clearance was fully reinstated and my name was permanently scrubbed from the federal watch list. You fix your own life, the government just stamps the paperwork. Julian stood next to me. I clicked my pen and signed on the bottom line. I traced my thumb over the blue ink of my own name. They tried to erase me, but I was still standing here and the federal system knew exactly who I was. We walked out into the heavy, humid afternoon heat. We drove back to the house in silence. I unlocked the front door and dropped my keys on the kitchen counter. Julian walked out to the mailbox. He came back inside and tossed a small stack of mail onto the granite island. Most of it was junk. But one envelope sat right on top. It was thick, cream-colored paper. Expensive. I recognized the looping, elegant handwriting immediately. It was addressed to me. From my mother. It had been exactly 7 days since the federal judge dropped the gavel. The house was completely silent. Julian was out at the hardware store picking up lumber. I was standing alone in the kitchen. The air inside the room was heavy and sharp. It smelled like lemon floor wax mixed with the bitter, acidic scent of over-roasted espresso beans. I looked down at the granite island. My eyes locked onto the exact spot where Julian had placed the laptop a week ago. The exact spot where the white box from the wedding reception had dominated my thoughts. There was no laptop today, just a single envelope. Julian had brought it in from the mailbox right before he left. He did not say a single word when he set it down on the stone counter. He did not have to. I stared at the thick, cream-colored paper. The stationery was expensive, heavy cardstock, the kind of paper people usually reserve for wedding invitations or formal apologies. Across the front, my name was written in dark blue ink. The handwriting was elegant, looping, and painfully familiar. My mother. She did not send an email. She did not leave a voicemail. She wrote a physical letter, dropping it into the federal mail system like a bomb with a delayed fuse. I picked it up. It felt heavy in my hand, carrying the weight of 31 years of toxic history. I slid my thumb under the sealed flap and tore it open. The thick paper ripped with a harsh, jagged sound that echoed off the kitchen tiles. I pulled out a single sheet of matching cream paper. There was no date at the top, no formal greeting. Just a block of blue ink that systematically stripped away the very last illusion I had about my family. I read the first paragraph. We did not know the exact details, Molly, but we let it happen. I stopped reading. I stared at the sentence. The words looked back at me completely devoid of shame. The letter continued. I saw the mail arriving at the house with your name on it. I saw the bank notices from companies I did not recognize. But we chose not to ask Chloe any questions. Because asking questions meant we would have to admit that we raised a daughter capable of doing terrible things. My chest hollowed out. A cold, empty void opened up right behind my ribs, sucking the oxygen out of the room. She knew. My mother saw the red flags. She saw my name plastered on strange financial documents arriving at her own house in Georgia. She knew Chloe did not have the income or the credit score to run whatever hustle she was running. But my mother looked the other way. She intentionally closed her eyes to protect her own fragile ego. She would rather let her oldest daughter be used as a human meat shield for a federal crime than face the ugly truth about her favorite child. I was just collateral damage, a price she was perfectly willing to pay to keep the peace in her fake, picture-perfect house. I gripped the edge of the granite counter. The cold stone bit hard into my skin. I forced my eyes back down to the paper. We always thought that family love meant believing the absolute best in your sister, no matter what, the blue ink read. We thought we were protecting her. I know you are angry. I do not expect your forgiveness right now. But if the day comes when you can find it in your heart to move past this, we will understand. No signature, no full name, just 3 letters at the bottom of the page. Mom. I stood perfectly still. The refrigerator hummed a low, steady drone in the background. I read the entire letter a second time. I scanned every single word, searching for the one thing that was glaringly missing: an apology. There was not a single sentence apologizing for what I almost lost. Not a single word about the fact that I was inches away from losing my military commission, my federal security clearance, and my absolute freedom. She did not care about the NCIS agents. She did not care about the threat of Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary. The entire letter was a cowardly defense of her own failure as a parent. It was a manipulative demand for unconditional grace. She wanted me to carry the burden of forgiveness so she would not have to carry the weight of her own guilt. I waited for the tears to come. I waited for the familiar burning sting behind my eyes that always hit when my family let me down. The sting never came. My eyes were bone dry. For my entire adult life, I twisted myself into knots, trying to earn their respect. I paid their past due bills. I fixed their wrecked cars. I thought if I just worked hard enough, if I just stayed quiet and maintained perfect discipline, they would finally look at me and see my value. But this piece of expensive cream paper proved the ultimate truth. You cannot earn the protection of people who are committed to using you. I lifted my hands. I folded the thick paper perfectly in half. I ran my thumbnail hard down the crease, flattening it out into a sharp, rigid line. I folded it again. I did not rip it up. I did not strike a match and burn it. I did not throw it in the trash can. I reached out and placed the folded square of paper on the counter right next to the espresso machine. I left it sitting out in the open, a dead monument to a dead relationship. I was never going to reply. I was never going to call her, yell at her, or demand an explanation. Because for the first time in my entire life, I realized I did not owe them one single ounce of my energy. I did not have to explain my boundaries. I did not have to absorb their toxic cowardice just because we shared the same bloodline. The cord was officially cut. I turned my back to the letter. I walked over to the kitchen sink, picked up a coarse scrub brush, and turned the hot water on full blast. The steam rose up, hitting my face with a wave of intense heat. I reached for the soap. I had a house to clean. The afternoon sun cut sharp angles across the kitchen floor. The house was completely silent. I was scrubbing the kitchen down to the studs. It was not a casual weekend chore. It was a tactical sweep. I had a bucket of hot water and raw bleach sitting on the linoleum. The chemical smell burned the inside of my nose. I dragged a stiff bristled brush across the grout. I reached the spice cabinet next to the stove. The wooden backing board was loose. It rattled every time I pushed the heavy glass jars back into place. I jammed my left hand into the dark, narrow gap, trying to press the cheap wood back into the frame. My fingers scraped against something sharp. I pulled my hand out. My fingers were coated in a fine layer of dry gray dust. Trapped right between my index and middle finger was a small square envelope. The physical reaction hit me before my brain even processed what I was looking at. A sharp, cold spike drove straight through my ribs. The air trapped itself in the back of my throat. I flipped the envelope over. Heavy cream cardstock, dark blue ink, a familiar, elegant loop. For M. It was the card that came attached to the white box. The delivery confirmation. The felony. Julian must have stripped it off the package on the day of the wedding and shoved it behind the cabinet to keep it out of my sight. My chest tightened. A ghost of that exact same panic from the reception tent flashed hot in my blood, a heavy weight pressing down on my lungs. But my hands did not shake. I stood in the middle of the kitchen staring at the blue ink. In 31 years, my family never gave me a single gift that did not have a rusted hook buried inside it. Every birthday card, every forced smile always carried a hidden invoice, a demand to take the blame, a demand to sacrifice my own peace to cover their tracks. This piece of cream paper was the ultimate bill. The absolute peak of their exploitation wrapped up in a polite little package. I turned my back to the sink and faced the heavy gas oven. I reached out and grabbed the black dial. I pushed it in and twisted hard to the left. Click, click, whoosh! The blue flame ignited underneath the iron grate. It threw a sudden dry wave of heat against my stomach. I opened the oven door. I pulled out the flat baking sheet. It was scratched, warped from the heat, and stained with old grease. I did not rip the cream paper. I did not crush it in my fist. Ripping it would mean I was still angry. It would mean they still had power over my pulse. I just set the card down flat on the metal tray. I pushed the rack back in, leaving the heavy door cracked open just a few inches. I stood there, crossed my arms, and watched. The intense heat curled the edges of the expensive paper first. It browned, turning a sickly, burnt yellow before the fire finally caught the corner. The flame did not explode, it just crawled. It ate the blue ink, slowly turning the fake sisterly affection into fragile black ash. The smell of burning paper filled the kitchen, a bitter, acrid smoke that stung my eyes and coated the back of my throat. I let it burn. I stood in the heat and watched the fire consume a piece of toxic history that never belonged in this house to begin with. The heavy thud of work boots hit the front porch. The front door opened and shut with a solid slam. Julian walked down the hallway. He stopped in the archway of the kitchen. He was wearing a faded flannel shirt, his jeans covered in fresh sawdust. He took one breath of the air. His eyes shifted from the sink to me and then down to the open oven door. A thin trail of gray smoke was drifting up toward the ceiling fan. He did not rush into the room. He did not panic. He did not ask what was on fire or order me to turn the gas off. He just leaned his heavy frame against the wooden door jamb. His eyes were dark, steady, and completely calm. The exact opposite of the chaos I grew up with. "Are you okay?" he asked. His voice was low. It was not a demand. It was not a trap to force a conversation. It was just a question from a guy standing in a smoky room. I reached over and twisted the gas dial. The blue flame died instantly, with a soft hiss. I picked up a rough cotton towel from the counter. I wiped my hands down. I wiped the dust and the soot off my palms, pressing the rough fabric hard into my skin until it turned red. I folded the towel into a perfect rigid square and draped it over the edge of the sink. I looked up at Julian. I did not force a smile. "Not exactly okay," I said. My voice was completely flat, echoing off the tile. Just very clear. Julian pushed off the door frame. He walked across the linoleum floor. He stopped right in front of me, leaned down and pressed his lips hard against my temple. "Clear is good," he murmured against my skin. He stepped back and walked toward the fridge. I looked back at the oven. The smoke was gone. The pain of the betrayal was still there, a dull ache buried deep in my bones. But the confusion was dead. The fire took it all. I finally had the map. 3 weeks had passed since the heavy steel doors of the federal courthouse slammed shut. I stood at the kitchen island. The coffee in my ceramic mug was dead cold. It tasted like bitter dirt and iron. I swallowed it anyway, feeling the cold liquid slide down my throat. I did not want comfort. I wanted the bitter taste to wake up my nervous system. The laptop screen cast a harsh white glare across the dark granite counter. Inbox. One unread message. Department of Defense. Personnel Command. There were no apologies in the email. There were no grand declarations of my innocence or speeches about justice. The federal government does not do feelings. They do paperwork. I clicked the bold text and opened the secure line. 3 words sat dead in the center of the screen. Status: active consideration. My federal security clearance was moving out of the dead zone. The system was turning my badge back on. I hit the print command. The laser printer whirred in the corner of the office. I walked over and pulled the warm sheet of paper from the tray. I held it up to the morning light. The black ink was sharp, absolute, and legally binding. I opened the heavy steel filing cabinet under my desk. I dropped the paper into a thick manila folder labeled Personal Records. Lieutenant Molly Butler. The leeches tried to drain my life, but they failed. That afternoon, I drove to the naval base. I parked my truck by the motor pool, laced up my running shoes, and hit the asphalt. 5 miles. Straight out past the chain-link perimeter fence, down the long service road, and back. I did not plug in headphones. I did not want the distraction of music. I wanted the raw physical sound of my own boots hitting the pavement. Smack, smack, smack. My lungs burned. The afternoon heat rose off the blacktop in thick, suffocating waves. The sweat stung my eyes, blurring my vision. I pushed my legs harder, lengthening my stride until my muscles screamed. I did not care about the pain. I craved it. Pain is honest. Pain does not forge your signature or lie to federal agents. I was not running for fitness. I was running to force the rhythm back into my own bones, to remind my physical body exactly who was in command. I hit the locker room showers. The water was freezing. I put my daily working uniform on. I checked the brass collar devices. I checked the creases in my dark trousers. Perfect, rigid lines. I walked into the administration office. The air conditioning hummed. The duty sergeant was slouched in his desk chair, staring blankly at a computer monitor. When my heavy boots crossed the threshold, he looked up. He saw my face, and he immediately sat up straight. His spine snapped against the back of his chair, a subconscious reaction to the rank on my collar. I did not say a word. I just slid a copy of the federal clearance form across his desk. I turned around and walked back down the main corridor. The fluorescent tubes buzzed overhead, casting a sterile glow over the cinder block walls. I stopped in front of the glass display case near the command center, the chain of command board. Rows of identical headshots mounted on crisp blue backgrounds aligned with extreme military precision. Second row, right in the middle slot. My face looked back at me. The eyes in the photograph were sharp. The jaw was locked tight. Someone had bumped the frame, and the bottom right corner of my photograph was slightly curled up, exposing the white paper beneath the gloss. I unlocked the glass case. I reached in and pressed my thumb firmly against the paper. I smoothed the crease out, pressing the edge flat against the felt board. I dragged my thumb over my own name printed on the brass plate below it. This was not vanity. This was territory. They dragged this name through the mud. They tried to bury it in a federal indictment, but they could not erase it. This life was mine. I locked the glass case and walked out into the heat. Night fell over the house, swallowing the exhaustion of the day. Out on the back wooden porch, the air smelled like burning charcoal and the rich, heavy scent of seared meat. Julian was standing by the black iron grill, using heavy steel tongs to flip the steaks. The yellow porch light threw long, sharp shadows across the wooden deck. I sat at the iron patio table. I had a small leather notebook open in front of me. I held a black ballpoint pen, the tip pressed hard against the thick paper. I stared at the blank page for a long time, listening to the hissing of the meat and the distant, steady hum of the highway. I wrote one single paragraph. The ink bled into the page. They mistook my silence for permission. They thought because I always took the hits, I would eventually break and cover their tracks. But it was not permission. It was restraint. And absolute restraint is never a surrender. It is a loaded weapon. I closed the notebook. The leather cover slapped shut. Julian walked over. He set a heavy white plate on the table. He reached into his shirt pocket, pulled out a small glass flask, and poured 2 fingers of amber liquid into 2 short glasses. Kentucky bourbon. He pushed one glass across the wood. He took a drink, his eyes scanning the dark tree line behind our house. "Are you ready to let it go?" Julian asked. His voice was a low rumble in the dark. I wrapped my hand around the glass. I lifted it to my mouth. The bourbon hit my tongue. It was sharp, bitter, and burned a clean line straight down my throat. I leaned back in the chair. I looked up. The sky was pitch black, scattered with millions of cold, hard stars. Real light. Not the cheap artificial bulbs strung up under a fake wedding tent. Not a stage built on toxic lies. I looked at Julian. "I am not letting anything go," I said. My voice was quiet, dead level. "I am just moving forward." I raised my glass. He raised his. The heavy crystal clinked together, a sharp hollow ring that echoed out into the dark, empty yard. If my journey hit home, hit that like button, subscribe, and comment down below. Are you a survivor too? Thank you so much for listening. I will see you all in the next one.